This is session 10 of the Lifeway study of the book of Genesis, chapter 20 to 50. The title is Accused, and the text is Genesis 39, verse 7 through 21. And the lesson summary statement is Pure living brings honor from God. I have two case studies that I'm going to start the lesson with. I'll read those case studies to you, and you may choose to use one or both of them, or change them in some fashion if it's of interest to you. Here's the first case study. I'm going to ask the class. Your grandson, or it could be your brother or your sister, your cousin, a nephew, your grandson just graduated from college and works with a well-known company in your city. He had to move 200 miles from home for the job, but he doesn't mind since you are near. You accompany him to a company dinner party and notice how uncomfortable he is around his supervisor. Later, you ask him about it. He tells you she has made a couple of passes at him. He just ignores her, hoping she will leave him alone. What suggestions about resisting sexual temptation might you make to him? Get the class to respond. And then I may follow up with a second example. A young couple in your church enjoys their neighbors because all around are the same age, and both couples have children near the same ages. The husband always leaves for work at 7 a.m., and the wife takes the children to school at 7:30. Several days now, she has noticed the neighbor's husband, who works second shift, always comes out to get the newspaper as she returns from taking the children to school. He insists she have coffee or come in to talk a few minutes. Since she knows his wife is not home, she politely declines the offer. One morning, he comes to her door with a coffee pot in hand. How would you explain how to resist sexual temptation to this young mother and wife? And I'm sure that will begin to get some of the discussion going. The transition sentence on page 113 says, temptation surrounds us, but as believers, we're called to honor God with pure living. In today's session, we'll see how Joseph determined to reject temptation despite the cost. The first point of the lesson is tempted, Genesis chapter 39, verses 7 through 10. And I want them to notice that the context in which these things are happening is that things are going well for Joseph. He has been bought by this significant household. He has been recognized by his amazing gifts and his integrity, and he has received promotion after promotion. He is experiencing great success. That's when this all takes place. Now, as I read through the text and give some explanation, I'm going to ask the men of the class to look for Joseph's thoughts or his beliefs as he faces this temptation. And then I'm going to ask the women to do that, to look for Joseph's thoughts or his beliefs as he faces temptations. And then secondly, I'm going to ask the men in the class to look at the process of temptation. How does this carry itself out? So, verse 7, after some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." Now we know from verse 6 of this passage that Joseph is described as being handsome and well-built. Now it's the exact phrase that's used to describe his mother, only of course for her it was in the feminine form. And as I've mentioned before, the only time the scriptures really makes a reference to someone's physical appearance is when it has an impact on the story. One of the things it says about David and his son Absalom is they were handsome, but it doesn't say that they were well built. Now they no doubt probably were, but the emphasis of the fact of Joseph being physically attractive and then facially attractive tells you that he must have been quite a striking figure, and he draws the attention of the Potiphar's wife. And so this statement that she looked longingly, she desired Joseph. And no doubt there took some time between her noticing him and beginning to lust for him, and then her actually coming to say to him, "I want you to go to bed with me." And so you may want to talk to the class about what are some of the things that would take place. Maybe there was some, initially what Joseph would have considered harmless flirting that was taking place, or maybe just an exceptional friendliness towards him, but it kept leading to something to where she was ready to act upon her lustful thoughts. When she says sleep with him, it is not a suggestion, it is a command. She is the master of that house, her husband is gone, and she expects to be obeyed. He is a slave, and he's supposed to do what she wants. But verse 8 says, but he refused, and the word refused is an intensive form. He completely and utterly refused her, rejected her. You see it in the way that he speaks to her. Notice the first word is look. It was an attention-getting word. It's almost like saying, whoa there, or stop right there. But it was a way of getting her attention. He said, look, he said to his master's wife, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house. Look at the freedom and the authority that Joseph has, and that he has put all that he owns under my authority. That is an amazing sense of responsibility. No one in this house is greater than I am. He's not bragging. He's just simply stating that's the position that he holds in the house. He is the manager. He's the supervisor. He's the steward of all of the Potiphar's responsibilities and possessions. He has withheld nothing from me. And that phrase, withheld nothing, is the same phrase that's used to describe Abraham when he was willing to give Isaac in sacrifice as a sacrifice to the Lord. And so it tells about the fact that there's nothing that's withheld from him except one thing, and that's you. Because you are his wife. He reminds her that she is off limits. Now, whether Potiphar said that to him or whether he simply understood that that's the master's wife, and the Egyptians looked down on adultery as well as the Hebrews, but he's also reminding her responsibility, what her role is, who she is. She is the wife of Potiphar, and he is the slave of Potiphar. Then he goes on to say, so how could I do this immense evil, and how could I sin against God? The word immense evil is the same word that's used in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, when it talks about the evil of the pre-Diluvian generation, the generation that God's wrath judged them with a flood. So Joseph is not diminishing at all the act of adultery that she is pitching to him. And then he says, how could I sin against God? The Hebrew word there for sin simply means, as it does in the Greek, it means miss the mark. And Joseph is saying that if he were to commit this sin, he would miss the goal that God had for his life. How could I sin against God? So he understands that it's not only a betrayal of trust from his master, and not only is it an evil act of adultery, he names it for what it really is, but he also understands that it is a betrayal of his God and the things that God has for him. He goes on to say in verse 10, although she spoke to Joseph day after day, that one time was not enough. Temptation came back again and again. In fact, literally it says day. And this awkward repetition is to underscore the reality of the daily pressure of temptation that Joseph faced from Potiphar's wife. Although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her. The word refused in verse 10 is different than the word refused in verse 8. This word means he didn't even listen to her. He didn't even give attention to her. Her repeated commands for him to go to bed with her fell on deaf ears. Joseph was determined not to let down his guard. So after that, I'm going to, after some explanation of that text and maybe a little bit more in depth you could share with your studies, I'm going to ask the class, okay, now ladies, what were Joseph's thoughts? What were Joseph's beliefs as he faced these temptations? Because you see, it's those things, regardless of what society said, regardless of even what his feelings may have been, it was his thoughts, it was his beliefs in the truth that he leaned on and he trusted in and he followed. And so I want to list those kinds of things. And then I want to come back to the men and I want to talk about, well, what's the process of temptation? And you'll notice that it starts with looking, and then it led to speaking. And what we'll see in the next text is it leads to grabbing. And so there was this process of temptation that took place. And it's good to understand that and to recognize when something is starting to cross the line. And he probably began to sense that long before she said to him, "Sleep with me." She began to show signs that he knew was inappropriate. Do you agree with this statement? The Bible clearly teaches that actions are preceded by thoughts. The Bible clearly teaches that actions are preceded by thoughts. If you agree with that, what specific actions should we take based on our beliefs? Now, we have a list of beliefs here on the board. So if these are things we agree with, what does that particular belief that someone has named, what does that suggest should be the action that we should take? Is Potiphar's wife's brazen, is it found in the workplace today? I remember in my first pastorate, a woman who enjoyed her job, and she began to be attracted to a man that worked at this job, and she was a Christian, and she understood this was not good. This feeling, if she doesn't do something about it, could potentially be harmful to her marriage and to her family. And so the action that she took was to quit her job, just to completely remove herself from the situation. In one sense, she does what we see Joseph do in the last part of this chapter. Now, the second point is we go from tested to trapped. And I want you to notice the difference between point 1 and point 2. There is tempted, that's the first point, and then this one's trapped. What's the difference? Notice the difference in Joseph's response. So there's one response we see from Joseph when he is tempted. There's a different response we see from Joseph when he is trapped. So, verse 11. Now one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. Whether he knew that, whether he knew she was there by himself, we don't know. We just know that, and we don't know why they were not there. But he's going to be in the house alone with this woman. That's the setup. She grabbed him by his garment and said, "Sleep with me." Now, the Egyptian male wore a tunic that hit him about at his knees. And it was like a long t-shirt. And he would keep it together with either a sash around his waist, or he would tie it into a knot, or maybe he might even tuck it in to his loincloth that he wore beneath it. But so when she grabs him and she pulls this, and he seeks to get away, and she pulls this coat from him, it's really this tunic, it wouldn't be too very difficult for her to do that. And that's the scene that takes place. And so he flees, and basically the only thing he has on is a loincloth or a breechcloth. And so, but it goes on to say, but leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. This word escape is a very strong word. It's used to describe a retreat in a battle in Genesis 14, verse 10. It is used in Numbers chapter 35, verses 6 and 11, of an attempt to escape death. And so it suggests an intensity of action. Joseph did not hesitate to take steps to remove himself from the clutches of his master's wife. There was no discussion with her. There was no rationalization again. He simply flees. He runs. When she saw that he had left his garment with her and had run outside, she called her servants, her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "my husband brought," now notice this, "a Hebrew man to make fools of us." Now she appeals to the racism card, and she calls him a Hebrew man. The Egyptians had a basic revulsion towards the Hebrews, so much so that we learn later they don't even have a meal with them, and it has something to do with them caring for sheep. And so there's this antipathy that they have towards the Hebrew race. Really not just the Israelites, but all Asiatic people. And so she pulls that, and he goes on to say, "He came to me so he could sleep with me, and I screamed as loud as I could." Now I want you to notice something. In verse 14 it said she called her household servants. The word "called" there, and then in verse 14 where it says, "I screamed as loud as I could," the word "scream," they're the same word. So she calls out to the household servants. They hear her and come running. But when she screamed, as she thought she was about to be raped, she says, they didn't hear her. Interesting kind of dynamic there, don't you think? Verse 15, when he heard me screaming for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside. She put Joseph's garment beside her until his master came home. That's the details that we've looked at as we've gone through the text. Now, I want you to step back for just a moment. And what is the difference between tempted and trapped? What is the different response from Joseph being tempted as being trapped? And what I'm driving at, of course, is, as I mentioned earlier, there's no rationalization. All he does is he runs from temptation in order to survive. That's what's happening here. And there are times in which it's not a time to reason, it's not a time to debate, it's not a time to resist, it is a time to run. Can you give some examples of running from temptation? For example, what would be an example of someone who runs from sexual temptation? And things I'm looking for is, I know of a man that because of his addiction to pornography, he doesn't have a television. I know that his computer is in the living room where everybody can see it. When he goes out of town and he stays in a hotel, he calls the hotel ahead of time and asks them to remove the television. I would call that running from sexual temptation. Well, that's what I'm looking for. What about running from gossip? If a person recognizes I have this tendency towards gossip, what are some strong measures they could take that would prevent them from falling into the temptation to gossip? Or how about this one? They're miserly with money, or they're miserly with praise and compliments. What are some ways that they could strongly respond to the temptation to be that way? That's what I'm driving at. I'm wanting to help the class see, yes, there are times in which we're tested and we need to have a rationale for it. There are other times in which we just need to get out of there because it's not something we can successfully resist. In addition to successfully defeating temptation, running from temptation, to successfully defeat temptation, you need to be running to something, not just away from something. And what you come to understand in the life of Joseph is Joseph was a man who ran towards God. He pursued God. And so, in addition to running from something, what needs to happen is we need to pursue something. And God is far more appealing than what we're running from. He has far more blessings for us than whatever we're being offered in terms of our temptation. So what I'm saying is, what I'm wanting to say to the class is not only do we need to have strong reaction to our temptation and get away from it, we need to also have a plan to pursue God. So what would be some ways in which we would pursue God when it comes to those three issues that I mentioned: sexuality, our gossip, or miserly? And so I looked up some scripture verses, and for example, with sexuality, 2 Timothy 2:22 said, "Flee youthful lust, but pursue faith, righteousness, and love with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart." There's a lot of instructions in that passage on how we could deal with sexuality, the temptation of it. And then gossip. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. There's many, many passages that you could have your class look up. It says, "Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth." And then how about being miserly? There's plenty of passages that talk about how we're to respond to our finances. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17 and 18 gives instruction to rich people and how they're to deal with their temptation to depend upon money. Now the last point is trustworthy. Again, I want to read through the text and make some explanations, and then before we get into applying it. Verse 17, "Then she told him the same story," talking about Potiphar, the Hebrew slave. Now that's an interesting twist that she puts there. She called him a Hebrew man earlier, but now she puts a Hebrew slave on it. It's to emphasize that this man took advantage of her and she is his wife. But notice who's to blame for this. The Hebrew slave you brought to us came to make a fool of me. But when I screamed for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside. Now what's interesting is she lightens the message to Potiphar. She leaves out the fact that he came to me so he could sleep with me. She said he came to make a fool of me, which implies that, but she's not as direct with Potiphar. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, "These are the things your slave did to me." He was furious. Now the interesting thing about the statement that he was furious, it doesn't tell us that he was furious at Joseph. It doesn't tell us he was furious at his wife, but he was angry. But there's suggestion that he knew there's more to this story than what he's being told by her because of what happens next, and had him thrown into prisoner where the king's prisoners were confined. Now the penalty for a slave who attempted rape was the death sentence. Before he died, they tortured him. And so this was what Joseph was looking at. And what Potiphar does is he doesn't throw him into the normal prison. He puts him into the prison where the king's prisoners are, which was a bit of an upgrade, but it's still prison. But it almost suggests to you that Potiphar knows Joseph, and he knows this can't be the case, but he has to do something to save face for himself and his wife. So Joseph was there in prison, but the Lord was with Joseph. That phrase is 4 times in chapter 39, and it's a phrase that talks about the fact that God was faithful to Joseph. And it said, and extended kindness to his hand. Oftentimes that word extended is associated with hand. Yahweh extended his hand, and it meant he acted. And so what he said, he extended kindness. And so God acted in Joseph's life to give kindness. The word kindness is almost untranslatable into the English. It is translated a half a dozen different ways in various passages of the scripture. For example, it's translated loving kindness. Sometimes it's kindness. Sometimes it's mercy. Sometimes it's unfailing kindness. Sometimes it's loyal love. Sometimes steadfast love. Sometimes just love. But in every occasion where this word it's in the context of a covenant relationship, usually between the Lord and Israel, and it expresses a behavior that conforms to the terms of the covenant. All of that is to say that what appears to be is Joseph is on his way down. And yet in all of this, God is being faithful to his covenant to see that Joseph is going to be on his way up. God extended kindness, and he experienced favor with the prison warden. It wasn't based upon his personality. No doubt he had an attractive personality, but it was based upon the fact that God had worked in this man's life, and he was giving favor to the prison warden for Joseph. What are the parallels between Joseph's story and Frank Camazo, I believe is the name? It's you'll find this story and go explore the Bible. And I went online and read more of the story. Camazo is the man's name, Frank Camazo, and he is an Olympic athlete, wrestler. He's also a world champion, and he tells about being bribed for $300,000 were offered to him to throw a match. And he tells about how he believes he got cheated out of this match that would have qualified him for the Olympics. But if you're interested, you can go explore the Bible and read the story, and go on the internet and read a fuller story. And what I'm doing is I'm going to use that story to compare to the Joseph story. And both of them are appealing to a sense of integrity and trustworthiness. I got this statement from Hobbes' commentary. Life is not fair. Justice doesn't always triumph. The innocent suffer unjustly. When you have done the right thing and are punished rather than rewarded, that is a test of faith. But Joseph's conscience was clear. He had done what was right, and he entrusted himself to God. God honors the one who stays pure. To close the class, I hope this is fun with the class. I want them to come up with a bumper sticker that represents this lesson. And I'm going to give them just a few ideas. For example, maybe the bumper sticker for this lesson is no good deed goes unpunished. That could be a possibility. Or how about this one? And these are mine, so they're probably very poor examples. This would be a long one on a bumper sticker. She said yes, I said no, the boss said jail. Or how about this one? This is a very popular bumper sticker. God bless America. But how about if you crossed out America and just said, God bless the pure? Have some fun with it. But you're driving home this truth. Pure living brings honor from God. He's the source of this honor. God bless you. Thank you for teaching God's Word.